Hi, my name is Chris, and in today's episode, I'm going to show you how to turn this into this, which you can then turn into this. Stay tuned. In this video, I'm going to be sculpting a piece of scatter terrain, something that I can later make a mold of and make repeated cast of from that mold. This first video is just the sculpting process though. You may want to use some different materials than I'm using, but overall this should give you a pretty good finished result if you follow these steps. Okay, here I've got a piece of masonite, which is an 1/8 inch thick. It should be sturdy enough to do what we need it to. Here I'm just drawing out a general shape, something organic. This piece of scatter terrain is going to be, I don't know what you'd call it, maybe an oasis, some sort of small raised pond. Basically it's a natural structure, so we don't want any right angles or 45s. And here, as you can see, I'm taking a couple of pieces of XPF foam just to get it up off the cutting board, so when I come around with my jigsaw I don't damage that. I realized as I was editing that I'm not wearing safety glasses. You should wear safety glasses when you do this. Also keep your little fingers out of the way. You need those. Now something I didn't record but I did after I finished cutting was I went around the perimeter of the shape with a piece of 60 grit sandpaper. Just something to get rid of all the little burrs and rough edges. Now, as you can see, I've cleaned up my workspace here, and I've got a stack of cardboard, which I'm ripping up. That's going to help give me the elevation I'm after, and the rough general shape of the terrain piece. Cardboard's a great resource to use. It's free in most cases, and you kind of know what you got with it. Now, personally, I think you're better off ripping up this cardboard as opposed to using a pair of scissors or an X-Acto knife or hobby knife. I think the ripped edges give you a more of an organic feel. It's just going to make it easier for you when you go to glue these together. Give you something closer to the finished product you're looking for. I probably spent 30 minutes ripping up various shapes and sizes of cardboard. Here I just kind of traced out this large piece. I'm just going to essentially make a copy of my base. It doesn't have to be perfect by any means. In fact, you don't want it perfect. It's just something to give a little more thickness to the base. I could have used a sheet of 1/2 inch MDF or thicker masonite or doubled up my masonite, but that just seemed wasteful. Cardboard's free in most cases, or in a lot of cases at least. Here I've gotten out the hot glue gun. That's what I'm going to use to glue all this cardboard together. Hot glue is fast and cheap enough. It's also pretty durable, and considering what I'm actually making here is going to be a throwaway piece, certainly durable enough. It's just the most time-effective, cost-effective thing I can use right here. You may hear Beatty, my cat, in the background. You do not see her featured here. This is actually my cat Blink on screen. She's not quite as vocal as Beatty is, so during the recording process, there's no telling if this cat's going to come up and sit in my lap and start meowing. Hopefully I can edit most of that out. I'm going through finding placement here for some of the larger pieces of cardboard. Just stacking at random, but try to keep everything fairly level. Not level across the entire piece. Keep the individual pieces fairly parallel to the ground. You want your models to be able to stand upright without having to worry about them falling over precariously or standing precariously. It's always difficult to find the balance between something that's aesthetically pleasing but also playable and structurally sound, cost-effective. Generally seems you have to sacrifice at least one of those for the other two or three. And that's something I'm trying to minimize as best I can. Now, I'm going for some varied elevations here, but I want to try to keep the center the piece low, because that's where my water feature is going to be, and add rock formations all around it to dam up that epoxy pour I'm going to be doing later on the casting. Here I'm just kind of seeing what feels right, seeing what looks right. It's always helpful to take a step back every now and then and look at the piece you're building. I certainly do that in between edits. Here I'm getting close to finding my finished height level. Just kind of checking out, looking around, making sure it's about what I want. And this is Carl. He's my little Nurgle Marine that is on a 25mm base. He helps me make sure that the majority of the surface is playable. I usually go over most of my terrain pieces with a 25, 32, and 40mm based miniature, just to make sure that everything's fairly playable, or not everything, but the majority of spots are. That way, squad cohesion's not too much of an issue. It's something you certainly want to keep in mind. Lots of flat surfaces for your models to stand on, especially something like a metal or resin model. You don't want tumbling to his death, or broken knife blade, or crazy wing, or whatever. Here I've gotten out some putty that I'm going to be using to create a skin coat over this cardboard. This is going to be my final texture, at least for the most part. I'm going to add some rocks and sand a little later, but right now I'm just trying to get some sort of texture, something that represents rock. I sacrificed not one, but 2 measuring cups for this. I think it was well worth it. But hey, that's me. Now this stuff's water-based, or mixes with water. You mix it generally 2 parts powder to 1 part water. When you're doing something like this, you kind of mess with those ratios a little bit. This is pretty forgiving stuff. It's I think it's called Durham Rock Hard Putty. In retrospect, plaster of Paris would have been a bit easier to use. It tends to dry quicker than this stuff. This stuff, before you can carve on it, you've probably got a 45-minute wait. A heat gun or a blow dryer would probably speed up that process, but I was in between a few projects, so I wasn't in any real rush here. Here I go, putting down a ton of tools that I didn't use. A few that I actually did, mainly being a wire brush, chip brush, and a couple of dental picks / sculpting tools. And if this is going to be your final piece, you don't intend on making a silicone mold of this and resin casts. I don't know that I would go with this stuff. I would probably use something like Sculpt a Mold. You've got a little texture in the Sculpt a Mold that this stuff doesn't have, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're doing something naturalistic like a rock formation. I'm using this because I know it holds up well. It doesn't react poorly to silicone. This stuff's fairly inert. This plaster of Paris, you can use either of those and make a silicone mold without having to really worry about any sort of ill reaction, so long as your plaster is actually dry. Again, this stuff's pretty forgiving if you don't mix it extraordinarily well. That's not necessarily a bad thing for your finished product. so long as you don't have any dry lumps of powder in there. Varied consistency isn't necessarily a bad thing when you're making something kind of natural. Got a bunch of brushes out that I'm actually not going to use, some that I will. Here I'm just putting this stuff on with a tongue depressor. Just kind of want to get a rough coat on everything. Something you may notice throughout this video is the fact that I've got a couple of phones set up there. I was taking different camera angles. That footage did not work out. I was pretty bummed. Hopefully you get a good idea of what it is I'm doing. I've zoomed in when possible, when I think it's necessary. It would have been nice to have been able to give you an overhead shot and, a shot looking straightforward, but I just wasn't able to do that. As you may notice, I do not know anything about video editing, shooting video, or narrating for that matter. This is all pretty foreign to me. The only thing I am sure of is terrain sculpting, so there's that. That's the important thing. Now you want to make sure that every surface is covered in this stuff. You don't want raw cardboard exposed to your silicone. And that's not that it reacts badly with it. It's just you don't want that absorbing into the piece there. Here I'm just taking a 2-inch chip brush, which I've cut most of the bristles down with. That's giving me a nice base texture there. I'm just trying to get rid of all those tongue depressor marks. Trading tongue depressor marks for brush strokes. I try to keep most of those brush strokes parallel to the ground level there. Trying to make that look like striation in the rock. I plan on going over most of that with a wire brush, various picks and sculpting tools to try to break up the monotony, give a little interest to the piece here. These chip brushes really are great, especially for 45 cents a piece. Honestly, I really can't speak highly enough of them for what they are. Just throwaway little brushes. And here I've got a few picks. I'm just kind of chipping away at the plaster, creating gouges and random crevices, cracks, little points of interest that most people probably aren't going to take any notice of. Just something to add character to the piece. Just kind of look over your piece, see what you got going on, make sure you haven't missed anything. And to be honest, you don't want too many undercuts. I am going to be making a silicone mold of this, so undercuts tend to damage silicone molds, or they at least have the potential to, and trap air bubbles. That's also something you don't want. Just looking over the piece here, just making sure I've kind of got everything covered. Something great about this putty I'm using is that after it dries, you can add more to it. This isn't a one-time process here. I'm sculpting, cutting away, adding more plaster, cutting away, adding more plaster. And here the wire brush makes its appearance. kind of tapping everything down, making sure there aren't any crazy brush strokes or tongue depressor strokes I'm not happy with. It's starting to come along. Doesn't look like a pile of cardboard anymore. Starting to get some of that feel of a rocky spring or pond, whatever. Here I'm taking a box cutter, a cheap 45-cent box cutter that I got from Harbor Freight, and just gouging out some random pieces. These things really are great. Kind of a necessity almost in any self-respecting hobbyist shop. They're well worth the money. Here and scraping away at some of the places I think crevices and cracks would be nice. Natural's what I'm going for here. No straight lines per se, just trying to keep everything organic, naturalistic. Also, it's important to have everything formed in such a way that it looks physically possible. You don't want some crazy overhang. Some overhangs are nice, but again, when you plan on making a silicon mold of this later, you don't want a lot of undercuts. Try to keep that to a minimum here. Taking a hobby knife and scraping, cutting, creating layers. I enjoy this quite a bit. It's very relaxing. It may seem boring, but it's not quite as boring as ripping up cardboard for 30-45 minutes. Even though this takes much longer. Here's Carl again, helping me to make sure that models will be fairly stable on the finished product. Now, something I've done, which I've not shown for time reasons, is I take a step back every now and then, make sure that I'm not focusing too much on one area. But yeah, you wanna take a step back. You wanna keep perspective on this thing. Maybe stand back, look at it from across the room, rotate it, look again. You focus too much on one spot close up without getting perspective on it, and something ends up looking wonky. Now, I sped this up as much as I felt comfortable speeding it up, but I kind of wanted you to see this. It's arduous. It's a long process, but it's important, especially if this is something you plan on casting multiple copies of. The last thing you want to do is spend all this time and $100 on silicone just to find out that you left some crazy brushstroke or fingerprints or something in this thing that you're going to have to address every single time you recast a new piece. There's nothing worse. I know from experience. Finally getting there. The wire brush is nice when the plaster is still slightly wet, or damp, I should say, not wet. You end up able to take away some material without it completely going nuts and destroying destroying what you've made. Just getting rid of some of those tool marks, some of those fingerprints, brush marks. Sandpaper can be helpful here, but you want to be careful not to get too aggressive with it. As crazy as that sounds in comparison to a wire brush, the sandpaper is a lot more uniform and you'll end up smoothing something out, whereas a wire brush, it's finding its own height or elevation, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, to kind of clean up there. A few more gouges with a hobby knife. Or box cutter, actually. Oh, how I wish that footage would have worked out from those other cameras. Oh well. Okay, here I'm taking some gravel, sand, smaller pieces of gravel. This stuff is actually oil dry, which I've taken various sieves and sieved it, I guess, to give me more consistent sizes in those little cups I've got there. Here I am placing some of the larger pebbles where it would seem reasonable for them to sit. Up beside larger rocks, something like a bird or a goat or a chaos marine or whatever might knock something off if it were sitting precariously or on top of something with nothing to protect it out there in the open. Something I've found over the years is that organization's very important when it comes to stuff like this. Kind of making sure I got these things in an ideal spot. Something that seems like it would be natural. And here I'm taking some of the sand, some of the smaller ballast, and just going around places I think that would look good. So, in retrospect, I don't know what I was thinking using this tongue depressor or popsicle stick or whatever to put this ballast down. I mean, it's getting the job done, but I guess the popsicle sticks have their place, but I don't think this was one of them. Using your fingers is really so much simpler, in most cases at least. There I am, just kind of blowing that stuff around, trying to get it into the spots I think it'll look best. Something like a airbrush would have been too aggressive there. I realize you can turn the pressure down, but still, nuance is key in this step. Here I've rediscovered the the sprinkle method. Again, putting the popsicle to shame. Oh well. Live and learn. Little flexi straw. It's helpful. You can see there in the back there's a syringe full of tacky glue, which I plan on locking all this stuff down with. I ended up not using that syringe, honestly. It was kind of a hassle. I went with a spray bottle. Dilution of, probably 2 parts water to 1 part glue. And that's just tacky glue. I could use PVA or wood glue or whatever, but tacky glue works fine. Here I'm just taking a rag and going around to soak up some of that excess glue. Also, there are a few spots where the sand kind of moved around a bit and ended up in some spots that it wouldn't be reasonable for it to be there. So, coming back, putting a little more sand. I'm going to lock that down again. It could be a time-consuming process, but in the end, it's really worth it. Especially considering this isn't the only piece I'm making. You know, I'm gonna make a mold of this and then be able to reproduce 100 of these, or 1,000. You know, if people are willing to buy it. So there's that. I am making these with the intention of selling multiple copies. It's kind of been a side hustle I've had for a while now, and it's something I really enjoy doing. Two, I like the fact that, you know, people end up with copies of these things and they're pleased with them. The money's great, but the fact that I've got pieces of terrain all over the world is, you know, it's pretty nice. It's a pretty nice feeling knowing that people appreciate what you do to the level that they're willing to buy them. Okay, so that's the sculpting process there, for this piece at least. Now, like a dummy, I didn't save this final part after I pulled it from the mold. So I don't have this to show you in close-ups. What I do have is a resin duplicate. Hey, if nothing else, it proves that, you know, this worked. Okay, I hope you found that video informative. Next week's video is going to cover mold making and casting in resin. The week after that, we're going to go over painting, flocking, water effects, that sort of thing. If this seems like something you may be interested in, subscribe, like the video. I'd appreciate it. All right, see you then. Thanks.